Hello everybody, I'm Yang. Welcome to our Tea House program. Today we are going to have a cup of tea with Mr. John Holden, one of the China hands who might influence the US policy in China. Mr. Holden is senior counselor at Hill Norton, China.
John L. Holden is the Beijing-based senior counselor of Hill & Knowlton, one of the world's leading public relations firms, and the first to enter the Chinese market in 1984. Before joining H&K, John established the Chinese operations of Shaklee Corporation, one of America's oldest and most trusted direct selling companies. From 1998 to 2005, Mr. Holden was president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. He developed and managed diverse programs that worked to foster better understanding and cooperation between the two countries. Previously, he was chairman and general manager of the Chinese holding company of Cargill Inc., where he was employed from 1986 to 1998. Mr. Holden has been active in the American Chambers of Commerce in both Hong Kong and Beijing, and served as chairman of the Board of Governors of the latter organization in 1997. Mr. Holden received a B.A. magna cum laude in Chinese language and literature from the University of Minnesota and holds an M.A. in the same field from Stanford University.
Hi, John. Welcome to our program.
Yang, it's a pleasure to be here.
Today I'm going to make some tea for you first.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I love Chinese tea.
Oh, really? Thanks.
It's one of China's great contributions to world culture.
Yes.
Tea is very healthy.
Mm-hmm.
It's also good for working because it helps you concentrate.
Yeah, and help you to relax.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that we can have a relaxed conversation this afternoon.
Of course.
I know that you left your PhD program at Stanford University before finishing your dissertation in order to start a career in China in 1980. What was it about business here in China then?
Well, you're absolutely right. I did leave a PhD program. At the time, I didn't know for sure what I wanted to do. What happened was a friend of mine called me up and said, John, the job market for professors is very bad. Why don't you try business? And I said, well, I never really thought about it. And she said, well, you can try. And if you don't like business, then you can go back and finish your PhD. So I said, okay, good idea. So she gave me a job in 1980 in the spring, and I never looked back because I was privileged to begin working in China during a time of tremendous excitement and rapid change. And so it was a privilege for me to be able to participate in the last 31 years of China's reform and opening.
What job did he give you?
My job was working in a translation company in Washington, D.C., and my job was marketing, so I was selling our services. And I also was an editor of some of the work that we translated. For example, I was the editor for the Chinese translation of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which is a very famous movie that the U.S. government contracted for us to translate. So it's called in Chinese, 谁来晚餐? Yeah, so I edited that, the translation.
Oh, I know that in 1981, you interpreted for the National Geographic team who searched the Yellow River Basin and Tibet for the acclaimed book, A Journey into China.
That's correct. Yeah. That was a very lucky opportunity for me. It was a wonderful experience.
What did that trip change your view of China?
It did change my view. I mean, I had been here first in 1974, and we traveled to the countryside, but I was able to see things in much more depth. It was a very good time in U.S.-China relations. Our bilateral relations were very strong. There was a lot of interest in exchanges, so we had lots of fun discussions during the course of almost half of a year.
I know that you even sold your beloved double bass for money so that you could make your first trip to China in 1974. Why did you think that is the right time to go to China then?
You know, this is sometimes in life there are lucky things that happen. In 1974, it was very difficult for Americans to come here. We had to apply for a visa in Canada, and oftentimes there was no response. So I didn't really think about coming here, but after I finished my schooling in June, I saw one of my professors who said, "John, do you want to go to China?" And I said, "When?" "Next week." And I said, "I'd love to go, but how much does it cost?" And she told me $2,100. I said, "I don't have any money, but I'd love to go. Let me think." So I went home, I thought about it. The only thing that I owned was a double bass. And so I thought about it and I said, well, I can sell this, pay for my trip. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And I can always go back and buy another one, which is what happened. 4 years ago when I came back, or 5 years ago when I came back to China, I finally bought another bass that's made in China.
What's the most impressive moment you have witnessed the changing of China?
Watching the opening ceremony of the LA Olympics, watching the Chinese team parade in LA was a very moving experience for me. And it was also very touching when I was myself a torch runner, and it gave me a chance to think about these changes.
Tell me more about it. What's your feeling of holding that?
I felt very proud to be carrying the torch, and it was a lot of fun when I did the exchange with the next person, and he nearly burned me. You know, it was really funny. So it was his idea. He said, when we meet, I said, what do we do? And he says, 拥抱一下. So I said, okay, great. So we get together, and he grabs me, but his torch, which is on fire, he grabs me like this, and 差点把我屁股烧坏了啊！然后那个保安呢，马上过来抓了，保护我了。我本来就不知道，That would have been very funny.
Well, after a cup of tea, we will talk about the China-U.S. economic relations. Okay.
So I'm going to pour this in here. And then I turn it over like that. Oh, that worked. It's very fragrant. Cheers.
You are one of the first Americans to come to China to do business in the 1980s. What was it like, and what are the business environment like in the first few years of China's reform and opening up?
Well, two things. One, it was very difficult and frustrating, but on the other hand, it was very exciting because the new things were happening every day. China was starting from a small base. There was very little trade, but it doubled and tripled very quickly. So, you know, during the course of my first 2 years, we saw demand from China for an increasing array of things to import, and we began to see more things for export. So, and why did I say it was difficult? It's because the infrastructure for business was not there. The telephone system in Beijing was very bad in those days. It was almost impossible to make a phone call. We lived in a hotel, our office was in a hotel, so we had to get the operator first before we could get an external line. And so making phone calls was difficult. We worked with a telex machine, and it also took the Chinese buyers a long time to make a decision for two reasons. One, they had to compare different suppliers. They weren't too familiar with them. And secondly, they didn't have a lot of foreign exchange. So acquiring a quota of foreign exchange was very difficult for Chinese buyers. So we had multiple, there are a number of reasons why it was slow to do business. But it was exciting because, you know, we met really interesting people. We were involved in interesting technology. For example, in 1983, I supervised the sale of American night vision equipment to China, and this was military goggles and telescopes that could be used to see at night. Mm-hmm. And in those days, the U.S. government said, yes, please do sell those to China, because we want them to have this equipment. And it was fun because I got to meet a lot of people in the military, in the Navy, in the Coast Guard, and went on a PT boat on the Yangtze River, and had dinner at the naval base in Shanghai with the head of the whole East China region. It was a very, very big honor for us, but it was exciting to do that, to sell image processing equipments to help China understand geology or weather systems and so on. So we got involved in really interesting things.
After China's entry into WTO, how did China's investment environment change?
Well, I think that the overall economic environment for China improved significantly after entry into WTO for two reasons. One is it gave the Chinese bureaucracy a blueprint on how it needed to continue reforming. And that was something that Premier Zhu Rongji had in mind when he pushed hard to get into WTO. The second thing is that people within China now saw more clearly where they could develop. And so I think business people became more active. But in fact, for foreign investment here in China, the real big push wasn't after WTO, it was about 1992, 1993. And we'd already had about 14 years of China's reform and opening, and multinational corporations were beginning to see that this was an opportunity that they couldn't miss. And so they began coming in and building businesses here. And now if you look at the big multinationals, you see that they often have very large businesses that go back 15 years or so, 15 or 20 years. And they're now very much an integrated part of the Chinese economy.
And how did the financial crisis influence the China-US economic relations?
Well, the financial crisis clearly, because it traces its roots to Wall Street and the lack of appropriate regulation over investment vehicles, was a crisis for not just the U.S. but for the entire world. It affected our trade relations because the U.S. economy slowed fast and our demand for Chinese goods dropped considerably. So factories in China that were set up to export lost a lot of orders, and many people were thrown out of work. Certainly more than in the tens of millions of people lost their jobs in China. So that was clearly a big crisis. There was a problem. There was pain felt by people in the United States who lost their jobs, people in China that lost their jobs. But from the two governments' perspective, there was a very good outcome, which was that they cooperated closely to coordinate their policies to help the world recover. And so what could have been a worse crisis, or perhaps even a depression, was avoided by collaboration between countries in the G20. And the US and China were very closely working together, and I think successfully.
Some media groups consider you as a China hand who may influence the U.S. policy in China. What do you think are the most pressing issue that China and the U.S. should cooperate to solve?
Well, first of all, I would not claim to be somebody who influences U.S. policy about China, but I'm active, I'm interested in policy, and I talk to people, and I follow things very closely. I think that we've seen U.S.-China relations develop through several periods. It's different now. The strategic drivers for the relationship are not the same as they were in 1971 when Henry Kissinger came here. It's clearly different 40 years later. I think that there's a level of mistrust between the U.S. and China that we must find ways to reduce this level of mistrust. Another way of putting it is we need to build trust. And how do you build trust? You build trust by doing things together, doing business together, solving problems together. If you take a particular small piece of U.S.-China relations, you could say it's very bad, the relationship is very bad. But if you look at the overall relationship and seeing what both countries are getting out of it, I think it's a good relationship, and I'm optimistic about the future. But I do think it's something that we have to work at hard. We need to have more people, we need to educate more of our citizens to understand and learn about each other. And so I'm very active still with student groups. I'm an advisor to many student exchange groups now in my spare time. So I think that's important. And I think it's important to take a long-term view of the relationship